Namaskar, I am Limbu Chandra, a student of second semester Master of Philosophy in English Education from Nepal in the Open University. Today, I am going to present a short video on why literary translation is a good model for translation theory and practice, which is written by Maria Timosco. This text has 10 subtopics, and these subtopics have been assigned to two of us as an part of internal assignment assigned by our tutor Mr. Keshab Sigdel and Miss Pratima Bhattarai. Now I am going to present my part as a presentation, and the rest of the part will be presented by my friend called Chandra. So, a presentation on why literary translation is a good model for translation theory and practice by Maria Timosco. So now I am going to talk some of the highlights of my presentation. Initially, I talk briefly about the introduction of the writer as well as the text. Next, I shall be talking about literary language and cultural asymmetries in literary translation. Similarly, I talk beyond semantic meaning, that is theorizing function and the symmetrics of literary form. And finally, in my presentation, I talk about decision making and metonymics of translation. Here, I am going to talk a brief introduction about the writer first. Her full name is Maria Fleming Timosco. She was born in Cleveland, Ohio, the United States in 1943. She is a scholar of comparative literature who has written about translation, medieval Celtic literature, and modern Irish literature, including the works of James Joyce. She is also a professor of comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a former president of Celtic Studies Association of North America. And finally, she is also known for her calls for a more international and multicultural perspective on translation. It's the short and brief introduction of the writer I talk. Now, I am going to talk two different terms of the text. They are literary translation and translation studies. The first term is literary translation. Literary translation is a process of translating literary genres like the poetries, plays, literary books, and it also includes literary text as well songs, rhymes, literary articles, and so on. Similarly, the next term is translation studies. Translation studies is an interdisciplinary which touches on other diverse fields of knowledge, and it also includes comparative literature, cultural studies, general studies, computer science, history, linguistics, and so on. Now, in my next slide, I talk great contributors in developing translation studies. As you know that there are some linguists who have really contributed in developing translation studies. They are such as Ruben Jacobson, J.C. Catford, and some other scholars, literary scholars such as G.D. Levy, Anton Povich, who were greatly influenced by Prague School. Marilyn Gaddis Rose in the United States, she has also great contribution in developing translation studies. Similarly, Theo Hermans, Itamar Ibn Johar, and Gideon Torre in Israel, and finally some other scholars who have contributed in developing translation studies such as James Holmes, Josh Lambert, Andrew Liverville. So these are the great personalities who contributed in developing translation studies. Now I talk two important terms in translation. They are theory and model. Theory, a kind of set of ideas, a group of facts, or maybe hypotheses established by certain observation or maybe based on the experiment, which is accepted as accounting for knowledge, as stated by Timochko 2007. Similarly, on the other side, model, which is necessary in developing and testing theory to make sense of a large and complex collection of data, and it provides certainly simplified schematics for positing and testing theoretical hypotheses, parameters, and principles by means of focused experiments. And model must be the right size and complexity and inclusive enough to cover all data presented by a field of inquiry. In this term, we can say literary translation as a model because of its encompassing literary practices through space and time across arbitrary languages and cultures. So these are the two terms in translation. Now I am going to talk regarding literary language is language retracts, and it best eliminates the role of language in translation theory and the practice. So literary language is very rich and complex, exemplify full of linguistic phenomena and capacities of a particular human language. On the other, literary language also consists of literary text types that are longer than many other text types, and literary content varies cross-culturally, cross-temporally. So literature and literary translation exemplify every language and language topology known from sufficient data. So literary tends to include marked and unmarked examples of syntax and morphology. Now, literary texts present multiple dialects and registers with technical language, whereas literary language is creative, innovative, and generative with syntactic patterns. Now, I'm going to talk about cultural asymmetries in literary translation, content and context in translation theory. Translation theory must account for cultural symmetries and isomorphisms. Literary translation provides best model for exemplifying both sorts of cultural asymmetries encountered in translating. In literary theory and literature criticism, literature is viewed as involving the interface of content, text, intertext, and context as cited by Wharton and Steele 1990. Literature is an ideal for modeling relationship of content and context, and literary translation exemplifies these relationships in rich forms. Literary translation also involves transposition. It means the changing of the content of a source text to a representation in another cultural context. Because of recursive representational quality of many literary works, the breadth interface in cultural content and context in literary translation is unrivaled. Now, this is my second last slide of today's presentation. Here I talk beyond semiotic meaning, theorizing function, and the semiotics of literary form. Meaning is both language specific and conditioned by context relevance, because sometimes we cannot get the real meaning as we think. There could be some other context of the meaning interpretation. So the differences between linguistic and cultural significance are excellent for illustrating shifts in shades of linguistic, cultural, and textual meanings. Functional meaning has been explored and theorized in translation studies as stated by Nida 1964. Meaning of a text goes beyond the linguistic and cultural meanings because of diverse forms. We may get other meanings which is not we see in the sentence. This is, you can say, also intended meaning. Altering form of any genre by translating is loss of semantic meaning and values. So when we change one genre to another, suppose a poetry into a prose form, then during that time we may lose its semantic meaning or maybe the values, because Nepali poetry exactly cannot be translated into the English. As a model, inter-Semitic translation and interesting features exemplifies the embedded and nested quality of Semitic system. Now, it's my last slide of today's presentation on decision making and the metonymics of translation. Single literary source text may have multiple translation of same target language or into a variety of target languages. So one text of source language can have different translation in the intra-language or intra or inner language. So necessity of making decisions in translating and interpreting results from linguistic and cultural anisomorphisms and asymmetries across languages and cultures. Now translation is able to capture every aspect of source text as much as by creator of text, because exactly we cannot translate one source text into the other source text as cited by Isar 1974. Translators must make choices about what features of source text to prioritize and privilege. Similarly, he can or they can decide which aspect to be adopted or which aspect to be avoided in terms of translating the text. So inspection of literary text illustrates that translators introduce features into their translated text, and the complexity of literary works and availability of multiple translations set decisions of translators and metonymic aspects of translating in high relief. So this is the end part of my presentation. Saying these few words, I am going to end my presentation. Thanking to all. Thank you.